Story 1. Many years ago, I worked at an office in the city center, just a couple of blocks away from my rented apartment. This proximity allowed me to frequently have lunch at home, which was a great way to relax in the middle of a busy workday. However, things changed when summer arrived. There was a bar located right next to the narrow door that led from my building's stairwell to the street. Occasionally, I would return home to find someone sitting on the doorstep with a drink in hand. Particularly on weekends, I'd politely say, "Excuse me, I need to get in here," and they would usually stand up, apologize, and let me pass. It wasn't a major inconvenience, just a minor bump in my routine. One day, however, things took a turn. I came home for lunch and found a construction worker, likely in his 50s, wearing a high-visibility vest and a safety helmet, sitting on the doorstep with a partially finished drink in his hand. As usual, I said, "Excuse me," but instead of moving, he glanced up at me with a look of contempt, then looked away and stayed put. I had no choice but to lean over him, unlock the door, and awkwardly squeeze past him. When it was time to return to work, he was still there, now with a fresh drink in hand, and once again refused to move when I asked to pass. The same scenario repeated the next day, except this time, he muttered a rude comment under his breath when I asked to get through. My frustration began to build. This man was ruining my once perfect lunch routine, and I soon dreaded coming home during the day. On some occasions, he would even be sitting there when I returned home after work. Finally, I had enough. I decided to observe him and took a longer lunch break than usual, eating a sandwich on a bench diagonally across from my apartment. From there, I watched him arrive at the bar, drink 3 beverages while sitting on my doorstep, and then leave. I followed him discreetly to his workplace, which turned out to be a building I was already familiar with since I am a structural engineer. To my surprise, the project he was working on was one where my colleagues were the engineers. I didn't know his name, but his distinctive appearance, a goatee and a mullet or ponytail, made him easy to describe. I visited my colleagues and casually asked what they thought about the site manager for that particular project. They responded positively, saying he was professional and easy to work with. Seizing the opportunity, I asked if they could relay a message to the site manager. I explained that one of his workers, fitting the man's description, had been spotted drinking at least 2 beverages every lunchtime at the nearby bar and returning to work under the influence. 3 days later, my colleague informed me that the site manager had been furious upon hearing the report. He immediately recognized the man based on the description and had no tolerance for such behavior. The manager followed the worker during lunch, observed him sitting on my doorstep with a drink, and confronted him as soon as he returned to the worksite. The man was fired on the spot, and the termination was done in front of his colleagues to serve as a warning to others about the consequences of such reckless actions. This incident sent a clear message to his coworkers and ensured that word spread about his behavior. Finding work in that town would likely be an uphill battle for someone with his reputation. Story 2. I've been living in my house for over 10 years now. My next-door neighbors were a nice old couple, and I have had a wonderful relationship with them over the years. Nearly a year ago, my good neighbor suffered from a heart attack, and sadly he couldn't make it. And a few weeks after, his wife decided that it was too much for her to stay in the same house without her beloved husband and decided to move to a different city to be near her daughter, who insisted that she come live with her after her father passed. But the thoughtful lady wanted to live in a separate place to not crowd her daughter's house and be a burden on her. Anyways, they put their house up for sale, and eventually a couple of entitled idiots ended up buying it. They were in their early 50s. And the word rude doesn't even begin to describe how they always treated every neighbor around them from the get-go. Demanded them to do some major changes to their own houses because it's looking bad to them whenever they look at it. Clearly the wife, Karen, was on the hoa board back in the community they were living in. So yeah, you could get where the demanding part is coming from. She was used to this, and it seems that she got her way most of the time. One day, she came to my doorstep, rang my doorbell, and demanded that I invite her in so she could discuss a serious matter with me. I complied with her nonsense, not because I have to, but just because that's how I was raised. It was all about good manners to me. I let her in, sit her down, and get her some fresh juice. She makes a snarky comment about the juice, but I let it slide. At the end of the day, she's a guest, and she's in my house, so I tolerated her nonsense a bit more than usual. Then she starts talking about how her son is planning on getting married 6 months from now, and how he's been looking lately for a house to live in after he ties the knot. More like they are looking for a house for him since he can't afford crap himself. They want to buy him a house. Up until this point, I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do with all of this pointless information to someone like me. I mean, yeah, congratulations and all, but okay. Why are you telling me this? Do you want me to lend you some money, or what exactly do you want from me? I had no idea. That is until she started spouting the most insane, entitled demands anyone has ever asked of me. I want to buy your house for my son. I didn't realize it at first. It went right over my head. I was like, okay, what house? As far as I know, I don't own any houses other than this one I'm living in. Sue, you must have been mistaken about something. Whatever house you're interested in buying, it's not really mine. At the time, I didn't even think that she would dare ask me or anyone else something like what you're all thinking right now. She then asks me, "Isn't this your house? You're the owner, right? You're not renting it." Well, yeah, this house is mine. But what does that have anything to do with what you're asking me about? Everything. It has everything to do with what I'm talking about. Because the house I want you to sell me is this house. I didn't believe what I just heard for a second. I had to ask her a couple more times just to make sure she meant this house I've been living in for 10 years now. When it dawned on me, I couldn't help but ask her, "Okay, so after I sell it to you, where am I supposed to go?" And her answer was, "That isn't really my problem, is it? I mean, you could go wherever you want to go. I don't know, try another state or something. That's your choice. I don't want to force anything on you." I just couldn't help it. I jumped out of my seat instinctively and screamed, "Get out." She seemed genuinely confused, as if she didn't know what the hell she just said. She asked me, "What? What's the meaning of this?" I kept shouting, "Get out of my house right now. Are you freaking mad?" She blurted some nonsense in return on her way out, but eventually went back to her house after she stopped for a bit right in front of mine and started calling me names. And she didn't move until I threatened to call the cops and tell them that she was harassing me. After this encounter, she started making my life a living hell. She tried annoying the hell out of me in hopes that she could drive me away from my own home. Even had her brat send thugs to my doorstep and office to intimidate me into selling my house to them. One day, I returned to my house and found my teenage kids freaking out and my daughter shaking and crying in the front yard. And when I asked them what's wrong, they said, "There's a snake in the house." What? A snake? In my house? Since when do we get snakes in this area? It's not even possible seeing things like that where I live. I called 911 and animal control, and they arrived within 15 minutes after asking us to stay outside. They went in and started searching for it, and after 35 minutes, they managed to catch the snake, but stayed for another 30 minutes to excessively search for more snakes since we had no idea how many of them were there. While all of that happened, most of the nearby neighbors stood by us outside of our house to check what's going on. And some even tried to calm down my kids, and they were very supportive. All except our entitled neighbors, they never got out of their house. Clearly a disaster was happening to their next-door neighbor, but none of them bothered to check what was going on. I knew they were inside because I noticed them looking from behind the window curtains in their house, while being weirdly calm about the whole situation. And when I caught myself thinking that they might be responsible for that snake showing up in my house, I felt guilty because I shouldn't be thinking horribly of someone, just because I had a bad encounter with them before. I know what you're thinking, but believe me, I myself don't know how I got that far in life with this naive mindset of mine either. But I promise, it's not like that anymore. At least not after what happened with these jerks. It took us all some time to start living comfortably in our house after this one incident. We were frightened for weeks, paranoid, and even imagining that the shadows in our peripheral vision were crawling on the floor or onto our beds. It was a traumatic experience to some degree, but we're good now. A couple of weeks go by, and I wake up at night to some extremely loud screaming coming from around my house. I jumped out of my bed, checked on my kids, then called the cops even before knowing what's going on, and told them that I'm hearing horrific screaming coming from around my house. Gave them the address and bolted out to the door. At first, I didn't see anything up front, but when I followed the sound, it took me to the back of my house as I suspected. And there she was. Karen is laying flat on her back, screeching like a banshee, and on top of her were 2 snakes crawling all over her body. I was overwhelmed by what I was seeing and had too many questions flying across my head at once, but her screaming brought my attention back to her and forced me to focus on getting her out of this situation. I tried to find a long stick or something to get those snakes off of her. I kept trying to push them away and even yelled at her to get up and get away from them, but she kept crying that she has been bitten and that she's paralyzed and can't move. It didn't take long for the cops to show up. They tried to help her themselves until the imps and animal control arrived. And eventually, the whole situation was contained. Snakes were captured, and she was taken to the hospital, all while screaming about how she's going to get me arrested and evicted from my own house for putting her life in danger by raising snakes all around my house. What she didn't know at the time is that after the first incident with a snake being found in my house, I couldn't really shake the feeling that this was not a coincidence or just bad luck. Just some random snake decided to wander into some populated neighborhood away from any kind of forest nearby and wanted to grab a cup of coffee in this one house of ours? Nah, I didn't know how to buy that. I mean, yeah, I was a bit naive, but I don't know. I just couldn't shake off that feeling. So I went and installed a couple of cameras around the house. I thought that this solution was satisfying for me at the moment. I'm not directly accusing anyone of bringing a snake to my doorstep, but at the same time, I'm taking my precautions and not fully ignoring my doubts and the alarms going off in my head. But classic me completely forgot about my cameras. I didn't check the tapes until my son brought it to my attention the next day. That, hey, we have cameras. We could check what went down last night using them, right? Oh wow. Cameras, yeah, let's do that. And we were shocked from what we saw on that tape. Karen was sneaking into our backyard with a dirty bag in her hand. She was carrying it carefully, and she was very keen on not getting it near her. She then came near my basement's wooden back door that was not in its best shape BTW and started to carefully open the bag bit by bit, as if she's trying to pour what's in the bag into a small hole I had on one of the wooden doors. And of course, as you may think by now, she brought the 2 snakes in this bag she was carrying, and she was clearly trying to sneak them into my house. Again. But to her surprise, one of the snakes decided to crawl the other way towards her once he got out, and that was obviously enough to spook her. She panicked and tried backpedaling but quickly fell on her behind, and that's when the other snake crawled out of the bag still in her hand and decided to have a field trip on her body. It seemed indeed that she was bitten a few times after she freaked out the snakes with her screaming, but I later learned that both of them weren't really that dangerous and that she was fine, and that what paralyzed her that day was probably the fear, not the venom. After I was done watching this, let's just say that it's an understatement if I say that my blood was boiling. I took some time to calm down, and after that I got my son to get a copy of the tape, and I took it to the station right away to file a report against her and, well, press charges, of course. I won't bore you with what happened next because it took some time and a lot of legal details that an idiot like myself hardly understands, but after taking this whole thing to court, she was found guilty. And eventually she was sentenced to 10 years in prison among other things. Plus, we're now filing for a lawsuit to get compensated for the emotional damage we had to endure. Her husband ended up selling their house after that to fund the court fees and for potentially paying me for the recent lawsuit we filed. Plus, it's impossible for them to keep living in this neighborhood after everyone knew what they did to us. And also, from what I've heard, Their son's fiancée left him after knowing what his crazy mother did to her neighbors. Overall, that was some really horrible experience I had to go through with my family. But at least there's a bright side to it. I locked up a Karen, gonna get loads of money from her, and I have an interesting story for you guys to listen to. Story 3. Here I am, a 72-year-old woman, sitting in a police station, giving a statement about how I had to defend myself against some young whippersnapper who tried to assault me with a chair. But let me start from the beginning. I've always been an active person. Even in my golden years, I make it a point to stay fit and healthy. My secret: martial arts. I've been practicing various forms for over 5 decades now. It all started when I was in my early 20s. I was a shy, timid girl back then, always afraid of my own shadow. One day, I got mugged on my way home from work. It was a terrifying experience, and it made me realize how vulnerable I was. That's when I decided to take control of my life. I signed up for self-defense classes, which eventually led me to explore different martial arts disciplines. Over the years, I've mastered karate, judo, and even a bit of aikido. It's been my passion, my hobby, and my way of staying young at heart. Now, fast forward to today. I was at the local community center for my weekly book club meeting. We were discussing a lovely romance novel when this young woman burst into the room. She looked to be in her 30s, with a fancy haircut and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She stormed up to our table. "Karen, where is she? Where's that old hag who thinks she can park in my spot?" We all looked at each other, confused. I spoke up, trying to calm the situation. "Excuse me, miss. What seems to be the problem?" "Karen, it was you, wasn't it? I saw your beat-up old car in my parking spot." I was taken aback. I had indeed parked in the spot closest to the entrance, but I had no idea it belonged to anyone in particular. "I'm sorry, but I wasn't aware that spot was reserved. There were no signs." "Karen, of course there were no signs. Everyone knows that's my spot. I'm here every day for my yoga class, and I always park there." I tried to reason with her, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I understand you're upset, but there's no need for this behavior. If you'd like, I can move my car after our meeting." "Karen, move it now, you senile old bat." Her words stung, but I've dealt with worse in my lifetime. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking a bit. There's no need for name-calling. Let's handle this like adults." That's when things took a turn for the worse. The woman's eyes darted around the room, landing on one of the folding chairs stacked against the wall. Before I could react, she lunged for it, grabbing it by the legs. "Karen, I'll teach you to respect your betters." She lifted the chair over her head, ready to bring it down on me. The other ladies in the book club gasped and screamed. But I wasn't worried. Years of training had prepared me for moments like this. As she swung the chair down, I sidestepped swiftly. The chair whooshed past me, barely missing my shoulder. The force of her swing threw her off balance, and that's when I made my move. I grabbed her wrist, using her own momentum to pull her forward. With a quick twist, I had her arm behind her back. She yelped in surprise and pain. "Karen, what the let go of me, you crazy old woman." Now, is that any way to speak to your elders?" I applied a bit more pressure, not enough to hurt her, but enough to make her realize she was in no position to fight back. "I think it's time we had a little chat about manners and respect." The woman struggled, but my grip was firm. Years of practice had given me strength that belied my age. "Karen, you can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? My husband is a lawyer." Dear, I don't care if your husband is the president. That doesn't give you the right to assault people." By this time, one of the other ladies had called the police. We could hear sirens in the distance. "Karen, you're assaulting me. I'll have you arrested." I think the police might see things differently when they hear about you trying to break a chair over my head. The woman continued to struggle and shout threats, but I held her firmly until the police arrived. When they entered the room, They looked quite surprised to see a petite old lady restraining a younger woman nearly twice her size. "Officer, ma'am, what's going on here?" I explained the situation calmly, still holding on to the woman who had now resorted to crying and playing the victim. "Karen, officer, arrest her. She attacked me." The officer looked skeptical. "Officer, is that true, ma'am?" Me. "Well, officer, if defending myself against a chair-wielding assailant counts as attacking, then I suppose I did." The other book club members quickly corroborated my story. The officer turned to the woman, who was now red-faced and sputtering. "Officer, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. We'll need to take your statement down at the station." As they led her away, she kept shouting threats and insults. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The officer turned back to me. "Officer, ma'am, we'll need you to come down to the station as well to give a formal statement." And that's how I ended up here, retelling this bizarre tale to a young officer who looks like he's trying very hard not to laugh. You know, when I started learning martial arts all those years ago, I never imagined I'd be using it to defend myself against an angry yoga enthusiast with a chair. Life certainly has a way of surprising you. As I finish giving my statement, I can't help but wonder about that woman. What kind of life experiences led her to believe that such behavior was acceptable? Perhaps she needs to find her own way to channel her anger and frustration. Maybe I'll suggest she try martial arts if I ever see her again. Though, on second thought, perhaps that's not the best idea. The world probably isn't ready for a Karen with a black belt. The officer thanks me for my time and asks if I need a ride home. I politely decline, telling him I'm perfectly capable of driving myself. As I leave the station, I can't help but smile. Today was certainly more exciting than our usual book club meetings. I wonder what next week will bring. Maybe I should suggest we read a mystery novel next time. After all, it seems like real life can be just as thrilling as fiction sometimes. Story 4. About 7 or so years ago, I was living in an apartment complex with my wife and a few roomies. It was one of those places that had just enough parking spaces for the people that lived there, so parking could be tight. So when someone, say, parked over 2 spots or parked really close to the line, people took notice. In this complex, we had maybe 3 or 4 handicap spaces, a few in the front, and one next to each walkway entering the complex in the back. Where our apartment was, it was closer for us to park in the back close to where one of these spots were. We did not need the handicap space. The handicap space was right next to a walkway, which led to the entire right side of the complex. The walkway doubled as the van access space for the handicapped spot next to it. For a few weeks, this one guy, we'll call him Bob, parked in the marked-off van access space with his very expensive car. Bob would park so far up the ramp that you had to step up the curb and onto the grass to get around his car. He was treating it like his own personal parking space. People didn't park there for a very good reason. Since it was the major walkway for half the complex, people carried groceries in via that path, moved in and out via that path, and just generally got to the parking lot via that path. Even more so, most of us knew that one of the apartments right next to that ramp belonged to a little old lady that had to use oxygen canisters. We knew that from seeing her and the sign bolted into the wall next to her front door saying as much. Fully within view of the walkway, she had lived there so long the handicapped space that was back there was labeled hers. I personally saw her struggle to get around the car once, as well as other people moving boxes or furniture. None of this even fazed Bob. He would keep parking there and ignore anyone else's problems. We complained to the office, who just told us to call the tow truck. We called the tow truck, and they didn't show. And Bob continued to treat the ramp as his personal, private, exclusive parking lot for his quite new, quite expensive-looking car. One day, while going out to eat and whatnot with the wife and roomies, Bob was parked there again. All 4 of us were upset by it, and a few comments were made. We got into our car, conversation still on Bob's weird behavior. I had placed the key into the ignition and was ready to start the car when I remembered something. There was something in my trunk. Something. Bad. I opened the door and got out. The wife called to me, "Hey, what are you doing? What are you doing?" She knew something was up, but I wasn't ready to fess up yet. She might try to stop me. I opened the trunk. I found it. It was a Tupperware. Inside was a leftover lunch. The leftover lunch was a full helping of ham, potato, and cheese casserole. Not the best meal that my wife had made, and she admits it, hadn't made it since. But when she had made it 6 months before, I took it to work with me and ended up eating something else, after which I promptly forgot the Tupperware in my trunk, where it lovingly percolated for the next 6 months through one of the hottest summers our area has ever had. Every time we saw it in there, we'd always grimace and comment on how we needed to throw it out. But we didn't, like we instinctively knew it had a higher purpose. The weapon, because it could only be that anymore, sloshed with what I thought could have been water in the Tupperware as I walked to Bob's car. I stopped in front of his car, standing on the walkway. I popped the lid open and almost vomited at the smell. I turned my head and took a deep breath through my mouth. The air held a tang to it that I could only assume was still part of the weapon. I steeled myself, moved my arm out to the side, and threw the contents of the weapon toward the hood of the car like I was sowing the seed of sweet revenge. The thing I remember best about the next few moments is that the contents that came out of the weapon didn't make a splash sound. A wet thud was what I heard. It struck the hood, dead center. The momentum carried the sludge up the hood and onto the windshield, then slid back down onto the wipers and air intake. I took the now empty container and hurried away, still holding my breath. I found the closest dumpster and threw it inside. Only once I was halfway back to the car where my wife and roomies were in, did I take a breath. I got into the car grinning like an idiot. The wife asked again, "What did you do?" echoed by a roomie, while the other said, "Should we be worried?" I just said, "We should go." The wife, "Oh God." Roomie 1, "Reg, what did you do?" Roomie 2, nervous giggle. We went and got our food. While doing that, I explained what it was that I had done to them. We headed back and parked in a space a bit farther away from where we had before. We took our usual route back to the apartment out of habit, which took us toward Bob's special parking space. In hindsight, we shouldn't have done that. I saw Bob on his cell phone looking at his car. I spun on my heels and started walking the other way, right past the wife and roomies. They looked at me confused and asked where I was going. I said nothing and just kept going. They followed me to another route into the complex that was much farther away, but gave us a clear look at Bob from behind as we got close to our apartment. Bob was talking to someone, and it was very clear he was not happy. I never got close enough to hear what he said. I just quietly and quickly opened the apartment door. Before I was able to go inside, I saw Bob get into his car and drive off. I can only assume to clean off the warfare I had sprayed over his car. I sometimes wonder if he thinks someone did that on purpose, or if someone just got really sick, like CDC level sick. After that, Bob never parked in his special space again, and it remained open for as long as we lived there. Story 5. This encounter happened about 7 months ago. A note that the kid in this story is the embarrassed kid, and the old gentleman is a 60-some-year-old guy. The kid was very polite and sorry, so this story isn't about him. Also, I'm translating this into English, so bear with me. A little backstory. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer of the nasal cavity, stage 2. The tumor was quite large, but thankfully benign. Edit. People have pointed out I formulated this wrong. By benign, I wanted to shorten the fact it still did not spread into other tissue. Thus it was still contained, which is what I thought the word meant. I apologize for my gaps in knowledge. To get it removed, I first had to undergo aggressive chemotherapy to make it smaller. Thanks to the chemo, I had severe alopecia, hair loss, which made most of my hair and even eyebrows and eyelashes fall out. At some point, I had to go bald, but I wore a wig because I didn't want to look like a skinhead neo-Nazi. I'm 6 foot 4 inches and pretty muscular, so I thought people would assume. So once, after a long chemo session in the hospital, I took the bus home. There's only one bus that goes from the hospital to where I live, so I took that one only to see it was absolutely packed. I felt really bad thanks to the chemo, so I asked a middle-aged dude to let me sit. He was very understanding and gave me his spot without complaining. If you're reading this, thanks bro. 2 stops later, enter the entitled mother, a lovely whale with an "I demand a parlay with the CEO" haircut and a 12-some-year-old kid. It took her roughly 5 seconds to see the bus was packed, start looking for a free seat, spot me and start marching, or, in her case, trying to fit in the aisle between the seats while shoving others aside. When I saw her, I knew I was screwed. She then stood next to me and decided to talk to me. This is the conversation that followed. Entitled mother: "Hey, could you let my kid sit down?" Me: "You mean me?" "Who else?" "Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm on my way from the hospital and—" Cutting me off, she said, "So are we." Nonsense. The stop was a few kilometers away from the hospital. My boy just broke his leg and we're coming straight from the ER. Her kid was standing next to her, without any support, clearly embarrassed. Me: "He's standing next to you completely fine. Look here, bot, I am 21. My kid deserves to sit down. Look, madam, I'm sorry, but I just got back from a chemo session in the hospital and I need to sit down and rest." I then moved my wig a bit to let her see my bald head. The entitled mother then straight up started yelling in my face. "Stop making excuses and get off the F seat, you skinhead piece of trash." At this point, I was baffled. I didn't know what to say. The kid was trying to make his mother stop, and we had the attention of the whole bus. She then grabbed me and tried to yank me from my seat. I held on tight and thankfully didn't fall off. Now, enter the old gentleman, my savior. The old gentleman: "Will you shut up, you dumb cow?" Entitled mother: "Who do you think you're talking to? Stop assaulting other passengers, or I will be forced to step in." Also, every dumb moron could see that the dude has cancer. No, he's just a skinhead. He's got no eyebrows, you witch. Seems like that really offended the entitled mother, because she spun around on the spot and threw a falcon punch in the old gentleman's face. I was shocked and in disbelief. The whole bus was flabbergasted, and the kid probably wished he'd never been born. The old gentleman then said something unbelievable and a golden, sweet karma moment followed. The old gentleman: "Okay, that does it. Harassing passengers on the bus, physical assault against a passenger, and now assaulting an officer. You're in deep trouble, lady." The old gentleman then pulled out a badge and told her to stay where she was. Then he pulled out his phone, called someone, and told her she was being arrested. I couldn't believe it. He was a bloody cop. At this point, the entitled mother was as white as a wall. The bus had just come to a stop, so she decided she'd make a run for it. But other passengers blocked her way. She then also got charged with resisting arrest thanks to this. 3 stops later, a police car was waiting for the entitled mother and her kid. The kid told me he was sorry for his mother's behavior, and I felt really sorry for the kid. He wasn't a bad child, but his mother was a hellspawn. The old gentleman then talked to me and asked me if I wanted to press charges, to which I gladly said yes, took a statement, and thankfully was kind enough to let me solve everything on the phone, so I didn't have to come to the police station for questioning. In the end, the entitled mother got some jail time. I think it was a few months, and some community service. I, in return, got a good story to tell and the sweet taste of instant karma. Right now, I'm riding the same bus home, as I just got back home from the hospital after a checkup, which reminded me of this. A friend, who's sitting next to me, told me I should post it here. He, as much as myself, also couldn't believe that such people existed, but it seems I proved it to him. I should also note that the surgery went well. I was declared cancer-free in November, and my hair is slowly returning. Also, I don't need to wear a wig anymore.